Hello and welcome to the session on universalization of secondary education. Education endows a man knowledge which is power capable of equipping him with the skills, tools and techniques unknown to him. It is the most powerful weapon that can be used to change the world. Economic growth and social development of any country is invariably associated with large and sustained investments in education and training. The fundamental objective of a democratic nation like India should be its all-round upliftment for the contented life of its citizen, irrespective of caste, creed, religion, sex and place of birth. Illiteracy of the citizens of the country denies them the fundamental right to life with dignity and freedom. Universal access to quality knowledge and skills ensure that everybody has an equal opportunity to play a full part in work and society. Elimination of illiteracy, therefore, should be the most important step that should be taken in any country. The road to national prosperity and happiness can be achieved by educating and therefore equipping every soul with modern knowledge and skills in every nook and corner of vast country. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares thus: everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. For the purpose of convenience, education may be divided into three broad stages: primary education for children at the age of 5 and 11 years, secondary education for children at the age of 11 to 17 years, and adult or further education for students above 18 years. India almost occupies the lowest rank in the human development scale by international reckoning because of the lowest literacy of its masses. It is because of this reason that India had accepted its obligation to provide free education at least in the elementary level for their citizens as a first step to fight this problem. India has included a number of provisions in its constitution which have direct or indirect bearing on education. The Constitution of India gives a few directions and suggestions for the development of education in the country. Right to education is one of the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution of India. The articles of Indian Constitution also provide right to education as one of the fundamental rights and relate to the following 7 aspects of Indian education: equality before law, religious instructions, interests of the minorities, free and compulsory primary education, education of SC/ST and other weaker sections, medium of instruction at primary stage, and center-state relation relating to education. Education in India is provided by both public sector and private sector. The control and funding for education comes from 3 levels: central, state and local. Before 1976, education was the exclusive responsibility of the states. The Constitutional Amendment of 1976 included education in the concurrent list. Universal access to education is the ability of all people to have opportunity in education irrespective of social class, ethnicity, disabilities, caste, sex, etc. The first step to this was achieved with initiation of Universalization of Elementary Education, or UEE. Primary education is one of the formative periods in the development of the child. So, the Indian state was well aware of the importance of ensuring universal basic education to its entire citizen. In 1950, the Constitution had resolved in Article 45 under the Directive Principles of State Policy that the state shall endeavour to provide within a period of 10 years from the commencement of the Constitution for free and compulsory education for all children until they complete the age of 14. Since then, there were important constitutional amendments that were intended to give a boost to elementary education in India. After the 1990s, An increasing number of countries, including India, have been successful in expanding their education systems as they have become successful in moving towards achieving education for all and the universalization of primary education. The National Policy on Education 1986 or NPE and the Program of Action POA 1992 also envisaged free and compulsory education of satisfying quality for all children below 14 years of age before the 21st century. Universal and compulsory education was a cherished dream of the new government of Indian Republic, which remains far away even more than half a century. However, in the recent past, the government appears to have taken serious steps to fulfill this objective. The pressures of economic growth and acute scarcity of trained manpower must certainly have played a role to make the government take such a step. Importance and scope of secondary education. The reform, strengthening and upgrading of secondary education is one of the increasing worldwide concerns of today, especially among the least developed and developing countries. Ever since the Constitution was adopted in 1950, the focus of educational programs has remained on elementary education alone in India. As far as investment in education was considered, secondary education had never been the priority area of investment. In the Indian context, balanced development of education is crucial for national building. While elementary education provides the tools for learning, secondary education gives the art of application of knowledge. Like other levels of school education, a significant progress has to be made in the sphere of secondary education. Secondary education is not a type of education, but a stage in education, and such it is necessary not only for a few but for all. The form of secondary education in India before independence was that prescribed by the foreign educationalists. Initially, secondary education was considered a subsidiary to tertiary education, as its primary function was to prepare pupils for higher studies. As time passed by, the secondary education was more linked to primary than to tertiary education. Around this time, secondary education also underwent structural changes. The form of education in secondary stage was modified after independence and was divided into three groups. From 6th to 8th, it was called junior high school. From 9th to 10th, it was called high school, and 11th and 12th was called higher secondary or intermediate classes. Soon after independence, some states made attempts to remodel their system of secondary education along progressive lines. Secondary education is an area of importance for the youth in preparing them for the world of work and to become fully functioning and effective citizens. Providing access to secondary education is a more difficult and complex process than is the case for primary education. The main reason for this is that it is in the secondary level that specialization of subjects begins. Moreover, there is larger number of stakeholders for this level of education whose views need to be accommodated than in the case of primary education. Another reason is that secondary education is far more expensive than primary education. For several decades, it has been argued that secondary education needs to be expanded both as a response to increased social demand and as a feeder cadre for higher education. Researchers from around the world suggest that secondary education is critical for breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty in a country. Studies also suggest that secondary education provides huge beneficial impacts on health, helps in raising the marriage age, reduce fertility rate, and improve child rearing practices. It is also argued that investment in secondary education yields considerable social and economic returns, making it crucial for national development. With the increase in the number of Indian children completing their primary education due to universalization of elementary education or UEE, the demand of secondary education has increased. Now, with the effect to globalization, it has been found that India has to generate technical power and develop new knowledge and skills competitive at the global level. The secondary and senior secondary education has a key role in enabling India to achieve this goal. Secondary education prepares people in a country for higher technical and professional education. So, India feels that time has arrived to take proactive measures to plan and provide for universalization of secondary education to its citizens. History. The Wood Dispatch of 1854 is considered as the Magna Carta of Indian education. It adopted a new policy towards mass education in India. In British India, the Wood's Dispatch was the first official policy document of the colonial government for public provisioning of education that promoted the growth of secondary education. This document started a new era in Indian education system by clearly defining objectives of education. With the new system of education by the British Crown, which replaced the indigenous network of schools and implemented grant-in-aid policy, helped relatively expand the secondary schooling provisions and acquire the status of aided schools. Later, the Calcutta University Commission, chaired by Dr. Michael E. Sadler, recommended that improvement of secondary education was necessary for improvement of university education. In India, new thinking on secondary education was started with the Surgeon Report of 1944. It recommended that at the primary stage, all children should have a common curriculum. After this, they should pass on to a stage which should be adequately planned for entry into other occupational spheres. In 1948-49, the University Education Commission, under the chairmanship of Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, aimed at investigating the different aspects of secondary education and made important suggestions. The Commission found out that the secondary education in India was the weakest link in the whole structure of education. One of the most important commissions appointed to look into the matters of secondary education in India was the Secondary Education Commission in 1952. The primary objective of the commission was to diagnose the pattern and suggest measures for reorganization and improvement of secondary education. Also known as the Mudaliar Commission, it recommended to develop a 3-year national system of secondary education after 8 years of primary education. The Commission formulated the 4 main aims of secondary education: training of character and developing qualities essential for citizenship in a democratic social order, improvement of vocational efficiency, development of personality and training for leadership. A commission under Dr. S. Kothari advocated for restriction of unplanned and uncontrolled expansion of secondary education. The commission found that such a practice deteriorated the standard of education system as a whole. It was Kothari Commission that suggested vocationalizing the secondary education. Thus, through appointment of various commissions and committees, the secondary education in India underwent several changes. The National Policy on Education, or NPE, of 1986 subsequently reiterated the views of Education Commission to implement a 4-year secondary education system across the states and the union territories. This policy emphasized improving equitable access to secondary education and the enrollment of girls, SCs and STs, particularly in science, commerce and vocational streams. Universalization of secondary education. Even after visible progress in secondary education, regional, gender and social disparities in access and participation continue to be a major concern. Although share of girls in the total enrollment at secondary stages has increased substantially, there still exists wide gap in participation of boys and girls. Relative to other social categories, the participation rate of SCs and STs in secondary education continues to be low. High wastage and low levels of learning achievement still plague the school system. Keeping in mind the changing developmental context and logically extending the policy of UEE, the central government had shifted its policy emphasis towards the development of secondary education during the 10th 5-year plan from 2002 to 2007. In India, the Central Advisory Board of Education, or CAEB, is the highest authority or advisory body relating to policy making in education. It allows a forum for the concurrent responsibilities of education at the central and state level to evaluate and envision policies and programs for future implementation. After the SSA program, the government launched a plan for secondary education entitled Scheme for Universalization of Access to Secondary Education or SUCCESS. In 2004, the CAEB constituted committees regarding the preparation of a blueprint for the Universalization of Secondary Education or USC in India. The CAEB Committee on Universalization of Secondary Education recommended that each state should develop norms for USC keeping in view the common national parameters as well as state-specific parameters. CAEB also recommended the states to develop their medium-term perspective plans for USC, go for decentralization as the main approach to planning and implementation of USC. It also suggested the state to invest in the public school system with the specific norms and standards similar to those of Kendriya Vidyalayas for enhancing its effectiveness. Universalizing secondary education means that all children of the age group 14 to 16 years are enrolled in secondary classes. They remain in the system, that is, their retention percentage is 100. All children transit to the first grade of the next education cycle, etc. The main goals of success were to make secondary education of good quality available, accessible and affordable to all young students. The program also aimed at promoting retention, providing infrastructure and provide quality education to marginalized group of people including girls, rural children and students of SC and ST. The committee focused on the need for four main issues. Universal access. Provide secondary education through creation of new cultural ambience and child-friendly curricula. Equality and social justice. Children should be empowered to understand, act and deconstruct injustice. Relevance and development. The full potential of students should be identified. Structural and curricular considerations. Gap should be reduced between world of work and world of knowledge. Universalization of education generally implies 5 important things, namely universalization of provision. This implies that adequate school facilities should be provided to all children throughout the country. Universalization of enrollment. Steps should be taken by the government to make sure that all students of acceptable age from the nook and corner of the country are enrolled in these schools. Universalization of retention. Simply enrolling the students will not suffice in the way of universalization. The success lies if the students enrolled remain in the school till the completion of their education. Universalization of participation. For the achievement of universalization of education, community is quite inevitable. The community is to be mobilized to take responsibility for identifying its own needs and take decisive role in ensuring the implementation of universalization of education. Universalization of achievement. For the success of universalization of education, the students is to be ascertained. There are several impediments to ensure the goal of 100% literacy. These are as follows. Paucity of fund and trained manpower, social prejudice, chronic poverty, wastage and stagnation, non-motivation of parents, absence of facilities, etc. The problems that hinder the goal of attaining universalization of education can be rectified with proper planning and enhanced financial assistance utilizing non-governmental organizations. Giving incentives such as free uniforms, books and midday meals can stop dropout rates from schools to a certain extent. Implementing policy of non-detention can help stop stagnation also. The targets for USC as spelled by CAEB committee included universal participation by 2015, universal retention by 2020, mastery learning by more than 60% learners by 2020, universal higher secondary education grades 11 to 12 by 2020. Conclusion. India is on the move again with the promise of a new renaissance in the making. It is emerging as a fast-growing economy in the world. The most powerful tool in this process is education based on moral and spiritual values on the one hand and science and technology on the other. The Education Commission of India has observed that if the pace of national development has to be accelerated, there is need for a well-defined educational policy. Education has to be used as a powerful instrument for social, economic and political changes. If we look at Indian higher education as provider of leadership and manpower in various sectors of economy, it is urgent to tune our secondary education. Secondary education is very much crucial as it is a connecting link between primary and higher education. The vision of secondary education to make quality education available, accessible and affordable to all young students of the age group 14 to 18 years has to be fulfilled. Traditionally, secondary education has been largely academic in orientation, equipping learners with the knowledge, skills and understandings necessary to go on to further academic study at the university level. However, it is now believed that secondary education has considerable value in its own right and it is not just required for tertiary studies alone. According to education surveys, the expansion of secondary and higher education level, both in terms of enrollment and number of institutions, has been higher than in case of other stages of education. Countries recognize the priority of secondary education as an indispensable link in the whole education system, especially between the primary and secondary levels of education. But still, in many countries, secondary education has become the weakest link in the educational chain. However, as access to secondary education has expanded, its overall quality has often been in decline since resources have stretched thin and systems have become more inefficient. Despite all efforts to make significant achievements in education, the goal of universalization of elementary education or UEE still remains out of sight, without which the goal of universalizing secondary education cannot be achieved. Secondary education cannot be expanded unless the upper primary education systems send adequate number of elementary students to the secondary level. Since free and compulsory elementary education has become a constitutional right of every child in India, it is absolutely important to push this vision forward to move towards universalization of secondary education, which has already been achieved in a large number of developed and several developing countries. Let us summarize what we have discussed so far. Education plays a very important role in determining a country's economic growth and its people's standard of living. Economic growth and social development of any country is invariably associated with large and sustained investments in education and training. It is because of this reason that most of the countries in the world have accepted their obligation to provide free education, at least in the elementary levels, for their citizens. India has also ratified the same and has included a number of provisions in its constitution which have direct or indirect bearing on education. Elementary education provides the tool for learning, whereas secondary education teaches the ability to use them. Researchers from around the world suggest that secondary education is critical for breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty in a country. Studies also suggest that secondary education provides huge beneficial impacts on health, helps in raising the marriage age, reduce fertility rate and improve child rearing practices. Government of India initiated Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan or SSA in 2002 and set targets for universalization of elementary education. Now, with effect to globalization, India feels that time has arrived to take proactive measures to plan and provide for universalization of secondary education to its citizens. The chapter is about the importance of secondary education and the launch of scheme for universalization of access to secondary education for or success? Now you can try to answer the questions given here. Define secondary education. What are the recommendations of the Secondary Education Commission of 1952? What difficulties are experienced in spreading secondary education in India? What do you understand by universalization of secondary education? What is meant by UEE? What is success? What are its goals? Hope that you may go through the reference books for further understanding. Vocationalization of Secondary Education Revisited, written by John Loglow, Rupert McLean, published by Springer, Netherlands in the year 2005. Education in Emerging Indian Society, The Challenges and Issues, written by Sunanda Ghosh, published by PHI Learning Private Limited, New Delhi in the year 2009. Reforming Secondary Education, written by Tigmurthy Bhaskara Rao, published by Discovery Publishing House, New Delhi in the year 2004. Problems of Education in India, written by Ramnath Sharma and Rajendra Kumar Sharma, published by Atlantic Publishers and Distributors, New Delhi. Secondary Education, written by Rao V.K., published by APH Publishing Corporation, New Delhi in the year 2008. Thank you for watching this program. Have a nice day.